I'm Alistair Stevens.
I'm Elizabeth Ray.
And Tom Cruise is Cadet Captain David Shawn in Taps.
I have to tell you, Alistair, this movie was not what I expected by a long shot.
What did you expect? Let's begin there.
I expected a boarding school drama. Like, I thought
Check.
Military school.
Check.
I thought, yeah, well, sure. I thought, it's going to be like School Ties. It's going to be
Sure.
like Dead Poets Society. It's going to be like a coming of age tale for these young men who are thrown together. I just was not expecting this like Lord of the Flies almost docudrama feeling that we ended up with.
Yeah, you ended up with something that is more like School Ties crossed with Red Dawn or Toy Soldiers or
Sure.
one of these, much more heightened, much more explosive, literally and metaphorically,
yeah.
films. Did you enjoy Taps? Let's headline this podcast episode here on The Last Star in Hollywood, your podcast about the filmography of Tom Cruise.
Did I enjoy it? I liked it. I thought it was good. Enjoy is a weird word. Like, it's not an enjoyable film, I would say. It's very difficult to watch and very challenging, but I thought it was very well made. I thought it was good.
That's an interesting distinction. I think that there's a lot in this film that I actively enjoyed, but you're right.
Really?
There's a difference between how you feel in the moment and your opinion on something coming out the other side. You know, how it sits in the memory and how you reflect on it intellectually after the fact rather than emotionally in the moment of experiencing the film. So you hadn't heard of Taps before beginning this podcast project?
No, not at all. I knew it was the next one on our list, and I knew that it was military school, and that's the end of what I knew.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really went in completely cold.
As did I, which gifted me a really interesting perspective on this early phase in Tom Cruise's career, because one of the reasons that we're doing this entire podcast, one of the reasons that we decided on Cruise as a subject for The Last Star in Hollywood is his iconicity. It's the way that he represents masculinity. It's the way that he represents a kind of romanticism, a kind of physicality, the way that he represents, above all things, perhaps, Americanism.
Sure.
And the way that he is so often representative later in his career of American militarism. And here he's giving an entirely different performance. This is a fascinating insight to me into the career that never was. This is an insight into Tom Cruise, the character actor. What if he had been stuck doing interesting character roles for his career and not turned into the leading man that he is very soon going to turn into?
Yeah.
Was Cruise good in this film?
Think so. He started out maybe a little bit rough for me. Like, maybe it's just because I now associate him with certain kinds of roles. So when he comes trying to be like the dick swinging, like swaggering bully kid, it's just hard for me to buy, especially when his first line is, "Hey, you're going to play Dungeons and Dragons with us later?" And then he turns out to be like the machismo guy.
Not with us. He's teasing Sean Penn's character there.
Oh, now I get it.
No one cool is playing Dungeons and Dragons in 1981.
I get it. I thought so. Okay.
Or at least that was my read of it. That is him
is.
taunting Sean Penn's character on the staircase there.
That makes so much more sense now. Thank you. Because I just took it at face value because he had just been so derpy in Endless Love. I was like, oh, now he's getting the dork roles.
That's really good, actually. Yeah, I can see how watching those films back to back gives you an insight onto his character in Taps that perhaps isn't going to be sustainable through the arc of the film as a whole.
That's hilarious that I missed that. It seems so obvious now.
Well, and we just live in a different world vis-a-vis Dungeons and Dragons now. In 2023, all the cool kids at military school, I'm sure, are playing D&D.
Yeah.
Back in 81. So the original Dungeons and Dragons comes out in 74. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons comes out in 77. So it's not quite at its nadir in 81, but we're about to get into the satanic panic, and then it's going to disappear for the better part of 15 years.
Yeah, sure.
That's basically the arc of D&D. But right now, in 81, it is very, very nerdy. There is so much to talk about with Taps. We've got Tom Cruise, of course. We've got Timothy Hutton. We've got Evan Handler. We've got Giancarlo Esposito. We've got Sean Penn's first major motion picture role. He'd done a little bit of television work before this, but this is his first movie. We've got the incomparable George C. Scott.
So good.
Giving what is, for me, a worthy candidate for the performance of his career. I think he is so exceptionally good, and the material is so exceptionally good.
Yes.
But all of that lies on the other side of a gulf for us, my dear, because this is the trailer game. And this is episode 2, which means that it's your turn.
Okay.
You have to improvise a trailer in trailer voice for Taps. Are you ready?
This is so hard because I want the trailer game to be fun and funny, but this movie is like not.
Maybe we can start mixing up genres. Maybe you can imagine that it's an animated musical comedy.
Sure.
Starring rodents of some sort.
Okay. The boys of Bunker Hill Military Academy are the future leaders of men. Led by George C. Scott as General Harlan Beche, young Brian Moreland will become a major, a future general, perhaps, as he leads these young men, you hush, as he leads these young men into an uprising that may cost them their lives and certainly a piece of their souls. Coming in 1981, Taps.
Bravo.
That didn't tell you very much.
Bravo. Yeah,
but
it told me everything I needed.
It's everything you need to know,
Absolutely.
right? Okay, thanks. Yeah. That was fun. That's hard.
So let's get into the behind the scenes of Taps. Like Endless Love, Taps is adapted from a novel written in the 1970s. Unlike Endless Love, this adaptation kind of respects the subject matter, though the novel, from my understanding, it's actually rather difficult to get hold of now, but the novel, from my understanding, Father Sky,
which is a great title. Father Sky
right?
is really cool.
It's
Yeah.
even more scathing about the dangers of this kind of blind obedience and this
Yes.
blind sense of honor. It's much harder edged, perhaps, than the movie turns out to be. There are a few adaptational choices which I find really interesting, which I guess we'll get into as we start moving through the structure of the plot as a whole. The novel was written by Devery Freeman, a longtime screenwriter who, in addition to working on a number of movies, is perhaps most noted in his writing career for working on television. He wrote on, I was thrilled to discover, like 60 episodes of a Nick and Nora Charles TV show called The Thin Man.
That's so cool.
I had no idea that existed.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it.
So many Nick and Nora stories in a 30-minute TV format from the late 1950s, early 1960s. I don't know if they're still available. I'll have to go and take a look for those after
Or any good.
the
I wonder if they're
podcast.
good.
Yeah. Well, it's Nick and Nora, so they're going to be
It's true.
entertaining at least. He also worked on Get Smart, which I know is a very influential and pivotal TV show that I myself
Definitely.
have never seen. That's not
Really?
one that made it across to Britain
Yeah,
when
that's
I was
probably
growing
fine.
up, at least. Freeman is, even more importantly than his writing career, though, famous for his work with the WGA. He was a union man who worked hard on defining the rules of accreditation for writers in Hollywood. The rules that govern who gets a credit on a screenplay for the story or for the actual writing. Those rules are arcane, they are labyrinthine, they are incredibly precise, and they are there to protect writers. And it's because of the work of people like Devery Freeman that we have those rules in place.
That's awesome. I respect the hell out of that.
Particularly here in the wake of the WGA
Yeah,
strike,
any day now.
SAG-AFTRA still out, of course, and we stand in solidarity with those individuals. But as of this recording, the WGA strike is in the process of being ratified. So hopefully people can just get back to work. That's not, I think, too much to ask. This film was directed by Harold Becker, not a filmmaker that I was terribly familiar with before I sat down to watch Taps. He has directed a film that I have seen and really enjoyed, which is Malice, the 1993 movie starring, Cruise adjacent, the 1993 movie starring Nicole Kidman, Alec Baldwin, Bill Paxton. Oh, I hate when I fall into a cliche trap like this. It is Bill Pullman in Malice, from a script by Aaron Sorkin. So that's a really interesting film. A tight little neo-noir. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I remember being rather fond of that. His cultural footprint, though, is perhaps more grounded in commercial television than it is on the big screen, because Harold Becker directed that one Grey Poupon ad about the two Rolls Royces pulling up next to each other. That one
That's a great commercial.
which I think people of our generation probably know more from Wayne's World than from the original commercial.
We just all said it as a kid. I don't know. We just said it all the time. we just thought it was the funniest thing ever. I didn't watch much Wayne's World, but I definitely know the Grey Poupon commercial.
This film also, as we hinted earlier, has an absolutely stellar cast.
Yeah.
Timothy Hutton at the heart of this particular ensemble, coming off of his Academy Award-winning performance in Ordinary People, directed by Robert Redford. He was maybe 3 months out from winning that Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor before coming into Taps. And gives what I think is an absolutely brilliant performance.
I think he's lovely. Yeah. It's a really difficult role. It's a very nuanced role.
Yeah.
And it's hard because he carries the film and he does lead the entire Academy into this. God, what is it? It's a
Rebellion, mutiny,
yeah,
insurrection.
Mutiny? Yeah, insurrection.
A loaded
is
word
a good
here in
word.
2023.
Yes, yes. And it's really important that we understand his point of view and his motivation, and he does that for us. I think we see
Yes.
how much he is enamored of George C. Scott's character of the general, and how much he is trying to do like the noble, honorable thing, while being. It's so clear. The film makes it very clear, or I thought so anyway, how incredibly misguided he is.
Which is a quality that I do associate with Timothy Hutton as a performer. I oftentimes think that he can give very impassioned and present performances, which are nonetheless undercut by the sense that this guy probably isn't doing the right thing.
Yes.
There's just a cadence to his performance, a shadow on his performance that always leads me to question his motives, if not his actions outright. And that plays beautifully here, particularly with this very still and stately cinematography that we're given.
Yeah.
The other headline, of course, for this film is that it is, as I mentioned, Sean Penn's first big screen role. What is your relationship with Sean Penn?
He's my boyfriend. I'm kidding. I don't have big feelings about Sean Penn as an actor, I suppose. I remember everybody talking about him for Mystic River, and I watched Mystic River, which was grim. And he was, of course, very good in it. But maybe it's the roles that he's in. I find him unenjoyable.
I do understand that, yeah.
Right? Just very serious and very like haunted, maybe. So, and there was some of that in this role, I suppose. But for most of it, I felt that it was kind of a thin performance, honestly.
I've never really enjoyed Sean Penn. I've never really, there's a stridency and also a self-consciousness to his performance that I find a little off-putting. He's got some of that like...
He has big New York theater energy.
That is exactly what I was about to say. He's reminding me of like an Edward Norton. He's giving me like a John Cusack to a certain degree too. There's an almost deliberate desire to be unlikable, to create a friction with the audience that exists overlaid upon the character. This is not an actor who will disappear into a role, I think. He certainly doesn't disappear into this role. I find him pretty thin and by far the weakest member of the ensemble, I would say.
Yeah, I think so. My big surprise treat was Evan Handler, who I thought was just gorgeous in this. He was so good.
Fantastic in this, and such great moral depth in such a young actor. This is only his second credit. Giancarlo Esposito, who is also fantastic in this film until his untimely demise, is also great. He had, I think, 5 or 6 credits already. He had been working since 1979 before he gets to TAPS, but also just great. And of course, Tom Cruise in his second credit after a small, little-known movie called Endless Love.
Never heard of it.
Doesn't sound familiar. We should probably check it out, though. We should be completists about the filmography, at least. Cruise was originally cast as a background actor in this film, but at the insistence of the director, Harold Becker, and the producer, Stanley Jaffe, he was urged to take the fifth billed position. He demurred at first, really had to be talked into it, which is one of 2 things about Tom Cruise in this film, which are perhaps surprising to people who know him better from his later work. The first is that he should be so reticent about taking a larger role. He will headline almost all of the movies that he produces over his career. He's rarely buried in the ensemble.
Yeah.
The other thing is that all of the primary actors were enlisted in a 45-day boot camp to learn how to act like young soldiers, to learn all of the parade detail, to learn how to handle their weapon, to learn how to dress properly.
There was a lot of that too. You could definitely tell that paid off.
It really, the depth of the detail in so many shots is just striking, I thought. Tom Cruise, however, did not want to take part in that and stayed in a hotel while all the other actors completed this 45-day training regime.
He must have done the training part at least, because he also had to do like the crazy rifle dances
with it all. Yes.
Rifle dances.
Rifle dances. You know how you learn, first of all, rifle dances?
It's, there's something rah cheerleadery about the whole thing.
We should probably have put this earlier in the podcast, but let's put it now. Why not? We are not experts on matters military.
No, we both come from like military background-ish
Yes.
families.
Yes.
But
my stepfather was in the Royal Air Force, and there was a tradition of service on
sure.
his side of the family, certainly. And yours?
My family has a tradition of service. That's why I'm in Oklahoma. We have Tinker Air Force Base. So both of my grandfathers were military. And that's how my parents met because their dads were stationed in the same spot. My brother very shortly joined the army and hated it and got the fuck out as soon as he could. So, yeah.
So we are connected to the military, and we certainly have a respect for our servicemen and women in this country and in my native land as well. But we are not experts. We are
Not
going
at
to
all.
get some of these details wrong. Did we have to double check and really give it a moment's thought that this was an army academy? Yes, we did.
Triple check it even.
Just to make like
Like,
really
is there
sure.
a difference? Is it
it's-
just military school?
It is complicated.
Until you like pick a team
Right?
that you're going into.
Do you have to
Yeah, like-
declare a major?
Yes.
I don't know. Do
exactly.
you get sorted into Hufflepuff or the Navy? I don't know.
Exactly.
But no, this is a U.S. Army Military Academy. It is a fictional, well, a quasi-fictional. There
Quasi-fictional,
was
yeah.
a real-life Bunker Hill Military Academy in Illinois, but
Sure.
it closed in like 1914.
And they shoot it at what? Valley Forge
They
Military
shoot it at
Academy?
Valley Forge
Yeah.
Military Academy as well. It is such an incredible location. Not even a
Yes.
set, but the locale is just spectacular.
Yes.
The cinematography in general, I think, very strong through this film.
Yeah, it really was. I think it didn't stand out to me, but it wasn't supposed to. It was for me more the I'm going to call it choreography that stood out to me.
Let's talk a little about the brilliant George C. Scott.
Oh my God!
The first
please.
act of this film is basically George C. Scott giving a series of monologues of
Yeah.
differing levels of formality. I find his delivery pitch perfect. I find it absolutely engaging and absorbing. I think he's brilliant in this film.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, after I watched the movie, I read Roger Ebert's review. And he said that it was worth the price of admission alone to hear George C. Scott pronounce condominiums.
It absolutely
It is.
And it's so vital. The film lives or dies. The film walks or
Yes.
falls based on the strength of that performance.
Yes,
We
his and
have to
Timothy
believe
Hutton's, yeah.
that these young men are so inspired by this figure,
Right.
who will then be somewhat deconstructed by the National Guard colonel as we move toward the end of the film. There are things about this film that make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There are things
Yeah.
about this film that I find so ambitious and enchanting, and ultimately, it doesn't all hang together.
No, but I wonder, this is one of the things that Ebert mentioned in his review too, so I'm just cribbing it straight from him because I didn't really recognize it at the time. He posits that it's really a fantasy story that just happens to be set in the military, in this military camp, but it's really not about the military itself or the school specifically, which is why I didn't even notice, but there's not a single other teacher or adult that we ever see on the campus. We only
Well,
see George C.
we
Scott
do see the
because
dean
he's
of
such a
students.
figurehead. Do we? When?
When they go to the armory, we see him twice. The first time when he is taking stock in the
Oh.
armory, and then the second time when he returns with the
Yeah,
sheriff.
but he's like a
But
secretary.
exactly right, right? That's
Yeah,
administrative. That's not
yes,
faculty
administration.
in the same way.
Absolutely.
I see what Ebert is saying there. I think it is unwise to try to extricate this film from its context. It's difficult to talk about militarism in
Right.
films from the perspective of the 21st century, looking back on the 20th century. In 1981, this country is coming out of a very unpopular military action.
Yes.
The reputation of the military, the civilian response to the military is very different. And the way that the military has been politically charged is very different than it is now, than it was 20 years ago,
Really
of course.
post 9/11.
But still here in 2023, I do think that this is a film that is about the military. I do think that this is a film about how we turn young men into leaders, young people, but of course it's absolutely
It's
just young men
in this
in
film.
the film.
Absolutely.
How we turn individuals into exceptional leaders in the military space and also not in the military space, but much more importantly, how we anchor the military in the civilian world. That, I think, is what we get from the National Guard colonel at the end of the film. And to a certain extent, Moreland's father,
Yeah.
who both managed to articulate just a much more sane approach that you know, it reminds me of the quote, oftentimes when criticism is hurled at J.R.R. Tolkien for The Lord of the Rings and the way that he draws these very clean lines between what is good and what is evil, we oftentimes overlay upon that an interpretation of the First or Second World War. These are thin interpretations. This is bad criticism, I think, of Tolkien, particularly because there is a letter where he writes to his son Christopher when he is stationed in South Africa during the Second World War, when he says, of military leadership, there are orcs on both sides. This idea that good service is possible, that honor is important, but when we are blinded to the civilian context in which the military exists, which is what has happened at Bunker Hill. You're right. We don't have any other teachers. We don't have any other faculty.
Right.
We don't have any other staff, really.
Yeah. And the word other, I think, is important too. Like everybody else, when they call them the townies. Anyone who is not in the military school is very much othered. And these young men are othered by them as well. Like it's cultish.
Do you think that this film has anything intentional to say about masculinity in general? Because as we discussed when we were watching
incredibly masculine
this film fails the Bechdel test.
Oh, yes, hard. And there's only one woman in the credits, really, that is on the crew side of things, who is the casting director. Everybody else is a man who has their hands on this thing at all.
And the only women in the film are mothers of the boys.
Mothers or girlfriends.
We have a few girls coming to the dance. We have a few girls wrapped up with the townies later. We have George C. Scott's housekeeper, I guess, is who that figure is. But that's really it. Apart from that, it's wall-to-wall men of action.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think it's definitely unpicking masculinity, leadership in general, what is honorable, and what happens when we tell men from a young age that they get to make and enforce the rules.
That's particularly interesting.
Yeah, and upsetting. Yeah. It's nicely done because, to draw back the curtain a little bit, Alistair and I watched these movies at different times. So I was watching by myself when you came in, and I think it was maybe a third of the way through at this point. And so we had not gotten to the insurrection yet, but we could tell that there was blood in the water, right? Something was going to go on. And I mentioned that I felt that the camera was impartial, was just kind of a fly on the wall. And you were fearful that the camera was not only not impartial, but that this was not going to end well, I suppose. Again, and of course, it doesn't end well.
It does, though. Cinematically,
morally, and narratively,
yes, it ends very well.
Yes.
It ends as it should, as it must.
As it must.
It ends. It is, of course, a tragic ending in the Shakespearean sense. It is a tragic ending.
Must
but
be.
That's it. It's unavoidable. We cannot permit this character who has fallen so far, Timothy Hutton's character, Brian Moreland, we cannot permit this character to be reintegrated into society. He has been poisoned. He has been poisoned by this excess of a good thing. This is in part what his father says to him during their scene together, the wrong execution of the right idea.
Yeah.
Honor is important. Loyalty is important. Obedience within a military framework is important, but you can't take these things too far. Right. Lacking the mediating force, lacking the civil presence of families and connections. This is tied back to what Beche is saying earlier in the story about many men my age have retired and they're hitting golf balls around. And yet they're leading lives. Yes. They're doing the thing that their career was supposed to enable and protect. They have not become poisoned by this militaristic hypermasculinity.
Now you have to quote Faramir for me.
I do not love the sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they protect. Unexpected amount of Tolkien in this week's episode.
How did this happen?
I wrote too many notes, and now we're talking about Tolkien. I guess it is my podcast after all.
Yeah, I wrote down a couple of George C. Scott's lines because they were so great and they were stirring. It was really important to get his character right because in order to understand what unfolds, you really do have to see the romance in it at least a little bit, which I've always been kind of predisposed to, probably because I did grow up so close to an air base and my first love wanted to be a naval fighter pilot. So I just assumed for a long time that I was going to be an officer's wife. This was just going to be part of what my life would be. Even my dad wanted to join the military. I should have said this earlier. The only reason that he couldn't was because he had an accident that blinded him in his right eye. So he wasn't able. George C. Scott has a line, "Man was meant to be a warrior. We're all sons of our Viking fathers," which is such a weird white guy in charge thing to say.
Yeah.
But also you feel like the ancientry of it, you know? He says these beautiful romantic things, but there's also this edge of gross white privilege and power behind them too.
Well, and even we are all the sons of our Viking fathers
Yeah.
is oddly appropriative. It has like you're right, a grandeur and a glamour. That old romance.
Yeah.
But yeah, is not a cool thing to say in a multicultural context, in
No.
a modern context.
No. He has the line too when they find out that the school is going to be closed. There's a feeling on the outside that schools like this are anachronistic, that leaders like you and me are dinosaurs. And I wrote that down because I'm like, yeah, I feel like that. I feel like the school is anachronistic and weird. And the kind of leadership that you're portraying right now is backwards. And that was, even for 81, I was thinking that because the film opens so beautifully with that long shot going down the row.
Gorgeous opening.
Gorgeous opening sequence. But they're playing some hymn, which I don't know. And I know a lot of hymns from my church days. So I recognized immediately this kind of like church setting, which is its own kind of rhetorical.
Yes. It's so interesting that we start there because I suspected that we were going to connect these two things, but there is not a lot of God talk in the rest of the film.
I think the connection is there to be made for people who are willing to make it or predisposed to make it. I certainly am, and it was the first connection that I made, and I think it was supposed to be, and that's why they started there in the church. But all the boys' backs lined up perfectly, nobody moving or stirring or scratching their nose or anything. And I was thinking about like the Onward Christian Soldiers song and like how much militarism is in the church and how closely connected those things are, and how when you get into this small, tightly knit group of people who have a very specific ideology, how difficult it is to think any other way and how simple it seems to know that you are in the right and how dogmatic you are about what is right, which is, of course, what the movie ends up breaking down so bombastically.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
That opening shot, I do think, is just breathtaking. It's almost 2 minutes long as we just slowly creep forward and talking about that sense of oppression, talking about that sense of imminent threat. There is, of course, grandeur. There is, of course, dignity. There is, of course, honor here.
Right.
But there's also that sense that, oh, this is going bad already.
Absolutely. Well, and then the scene ends with George C. Scott reading from the Book of Remembrance, which is like every kid who left here and died in the war.
There's also, as we finish moving forward, at the end of this 2-minute shot, as we're moving through this church space, we cut to a hard inversion of our POV. We suddenly look back toward the door. And for some reason, it feels like a horror movie shot. It feels in its suddenness and its specificity and also in the geometry of the composition very much like The Shining, which, of course, would have been a major influence on cinematographers at this time.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But all through this, there is this feeling of yes, ancientry and yes, dignity, but also something that is coming.
Yes.
And then we cut very hard to the dorm space and all of its life and energy and spontaneity, even though these young men are very disciplined, even though these young men all want to be here, that they are all striving for a kind of, ordered greatness. It feels very organic. This is, of course, where we're introduced on the staircase to Alex Dwyer, to the Sean Penn character, and to David Shawn, the Tom Cruise character, with that line about Dungeons and Dragons, which is where I wrote down in my note, this film is relevant to my interests. And then we move into Brian Moreland. We get to meet Timothy Hutton. We get just a moment of him with Penn before he goes off to meet with Harlan Beche, the general, to go off and be awarded the rank of cadet major. He is the incoming senior
head boy.
He's head boy. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
So Beche has dinner with the new guy and the old guy, whose name is Cooper, who is obviously a wiser young man, who obviously hasn't fallen so completely under the sway of Beche. He has that lovely moment later in the film as he's leaving, before everything goes horribly wrong, where he pulls up in his car and he shakes Moreland's hands, and then he gets out of Dodge. And there's this sense that he's going to go on to be a good soldier.
Right.
He is not going to be caught up in this. This is indicated early when Beche puts out that, quote, the one permanent part of a man's life, and Moreland says, honor. before Cooper can get to it, before Beche can finish the quote, he's demonstrating this
Yeah.
impossible eagerness. It's great stuff. And everything. Yes, you're right. There's so much here that is presented to us as polished gravitas. We've got George C. Scott opining, but the script is so sharp and so deliberate in the way that it makes us uncomfortable as viewers.
Yes.
In the way that it begins to set up this polarity within the narrative space. It would be easy, I think, to watch this film casually, to watch it without due attention, and to think that it is a hoorah military tragedy. That
Totally.
this is about how great soldiers are and how the civilian world doesn't deserve them.
Yes, horrifyingly, on the IMDb page, there's that list on the right that's like user lists
Oh,
where
sure.
users create lists.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
no.
Oh, yeah. So some are just like Sean Penn, whatever. This list
I
says...
would create an IMDb list called Sean Penn, whatever.
One says, Sean Penn movies I've seen. I'm like, okay, sure. But one list says uncut masculinity. And I'm not going to click on that.
Yeah.
I don't want that to exist.
No, we are. I mean, we should acknowledge, I'm sure it's implicit if you've listened to us for more than 5 minutes, we're all on the same page here. But we are, of course, skirting a giant toxic masculine guns and God dumping ground that is off at the side of our culture right now and making gross inroads into the rest of our culture sometimes. But yeah, there is a profoundly the minute that someone says that they're remaking Taps, I check out. I am done. I am not, going
Oh,
to
you think that they would turn it sour?
There is no way that you could make this film in 2023.
I think you're right. I'm
Certainly not from a major studio. Certainly not.
Yeah.
As a criticism of a military academy, I mean...
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. Good luck getting funding.
This is one of the ways in which I disagree respectfully with Ebert, that I do not think that the militarism of this film can be removed from its text. It's not just about great men. It's not just the great man theory of history, right? It's more than that. It is actually about the thing that it presents itself as, which is the relationship between the military and the civilian world. But we're firmly entrenched with the civilian world. We are on the side of the civilians here.
I think the film is nuanced in its take on the role of civilians too, though, because they're presented at first, as the townies who come and are like mocking everybody and starting the fight, and they look like assholes at first.
They do.
And
Absolutely.
so you're worried. You're like, is this movie trying to put the U.S. military on the back foot and say that they're the underdogs? Which, of course, it doesn't end up ultimately doing.
But it does crucially feel like that in the first act. It
which
does
is important,
so much in
again,
that first act.
Which, to get us not on side with Hutton, with Brian Moreland, but to help us to understand how he might make the decisions that he ends up making and how so many young men will go with him.
But you're right. I think perhaps I'm overstating my position here. This is not an anti-military film. This is not, decrying real good, effective soldiery. In fact, arguably the two best people in the entire thing. Well, the three, if you include Evan Handler, of course.
Evan Handler is
The
great.
three best people are good soldiers.
Yes. That's one of the things that was so, I thought, important also that the film did, is that Evan Handler is the first to step forward to leave. But he does it in full military style. He puts his weapon down. He comes forward. He salutes. He says, permission to exit duty, captain, or whatever it is, major, I guess. And the permission is granted. He doesn't just fuck off.
No,
you know?
he leads his man out. They are his men out, and he takes command of them, and he leads them out properly.
It's beautiful.
It's a great moment.
It's a great moment. It's lovely to watch. And the fact that he is separating the wheat from the chaff, as it were, he's taking the good of what he has learned out the door and leaving the bad of what he has learned.
Yeah.
And I really wish that they had given more nuance to Tom Cruise's character, because he just ends up an idiot with a machine gun. Well, I think
he is an idiot and he does have a machine gun, but to me, he is more reflective of Brian Moreland, that Timothy Hutton is giving us this character who is all honor and no action. He is staid and fixed, as General Beche is, right? He's not moving. Yeah. He is a static figure. And even the fight to preserve the school is a fight to preserve. It is a conservative argument. Mm-hmm. Whereas David Shawn, Tom Cruise's character, is all action with no honor. They are, it seems to me, kind of bracketing what it is to be a good soldier. We have one extreme where you are all dignity and all principle and no humanity, and the other where you are all savagery and no humanity. And in the middle, you have the vast bulk of soldiers as they are presented to us in the course of this film. You have Evan Handler, you have Sean Penn, you have Giancarlo Esposito.
Yeah, and there's even the conversation where Evan Handler, what's his character? We should talk about him. Lieutenant West is
Yes,
his name.
Edward West.
So Lieutenant West comes in to speak with Major Moreland,
Mhm.
and he has just been doing like a proximity check. I don't know what you call these things because I'm not in the military, but he's been going around making sure everybody's doing their job, and he checks on one of the guys who's in David Sean's Red Beret group.
Yes.
A sentry? Is that
Yes.
yes, a sentry. And he says, "What are your orders, sir?" And the guy says, "To shoot anything that comes over this wall."
Over, under, or around this wall.
Over, under, or around
Yeah.
this wall.
Which is expressly not the command that had been given by Moreland
Not
in
at
the
all.
preceding scene.
No,
which
no.
was, do not fire unless I give the order.
Yes. Yes.
So there we already see that David Sean is taking matters into his own hands and trying to force a confrontation with the National Guard because what he
Yes.
wants is death and glory.
What he wants. Yes. 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 However, what I was getting to is that when Lieutenant West comes in and relays that story to Major Moreland, you anticipate that Major Moreland will say, "Oh, I'll go talk to those guys. I got to calm them down." But instead, he says, "That's a sentry's job. That's what I want a sentry to do." I remember having a conversation with a guy that I worked with who had joined the police force when I lived in Wisconsin, relaying a horrible detail from the evening before. And I was so shocked by it that I talked to my dad about it because it bothered me a lot. And I remember my dad saying, "Those are the guys you want on the front line, though." And I was like, shit, I know what you mean. I don't know that I agree, but you, to an extent, need someone who can just turn off the light on empathy for a minute. I suppose I wanted more of that kind of intelligent argument from the movie than we got. We got a little bit of it, but I would have liked to have more sympathy and more understanding of David Sean before he went apeshit in that tower.
See, I think that his is the character that doesn't get sympathy and understanding because he is not a character. He is what is animalistic in the human nature, right? This film asserts that men exist on a spectrum between the bestial and the angelic, right? That what redeems us is honor. What redeems us is loyalty. What redeems us is order.
Mm-hmm.
And that David Sean is what happens when we don't have those things, when he doesn't have what we might think of most broadly as discipline. So I don't think that he gets humanity and complexity within the frame of the film, because really within the frame of the film, he is not human. He is not like entirely human. He is the bestial part of us.
That is interesting because that's another George C. Scott line when he's talking to Moreland, when Moreland comes in and is worried that he should not have been promoted major because his first thought when he heard the school was shutting down was
Right.
not for his fellow man, it was for himself.
Yeah.
And George C. Scott tells him, Harlan Beche.
Harlan Beche. Yes.
General Harlan Beche tells him that it is, in fact, his humanity which will make him a great leader, and to never apologize for being human, even if that means that you're thinking about yourself for a moment and your own feelings for a moment, and not just eye on the prize, you know?
Though we have to question, I suppose, whether or not he means that, and whether or not that actually has any applicability to the life of the kind of soldier that Beche is and the kind of soldier that he is turning Moreland into.
This is interesting because he really is presented to us like a perfect soldier, as a perfect general. Like that's how we see the boys seeing him, I think.
Yes.
And the things I described earlier, like he orates so beautifully and he sees the romance in service so beautifully, that I guess we just assume that he is himself a great soldier, or what the film believes a great soldier is. But then when we meet Moreland's actual dad, who is a soldier as well, he says, you know, you respect this guy so much, but he's been passed up for duty so many times. He's got, what do you say, like
articulating this real those who can't teach kind of philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, of course, garbage in the real world.
In the end, I don't think that Beche is supposed to have been a great general. I think, in fact, we get the best version of a serviceman and a leader in the leader of the National Guard who comes in.
Colonel Kirby.
Colonel Kirby, yeah.
Absolutely.
I think he is the one.
He is our icon of good soldiery
Yes.
at the end of this film. Yeah.
And he tells Moreland, I know what you are. You're a death lover. Someone has made you fall in love with death and told you it was honorable.
And that's not what being a soldier is.
Right.
We're
right.
a long way down the track here
We
in terms of
are.
our breakdown of this film. I do think it's interesting, though, that it is possible to kind of half squint and tilt your head slightly and see Beche as the figure that Moreland sees him as.
Mm-hmm.
But the active audience who is engaging with the text will get these little,
Yes.
tripping hazards. We'll get
Yes.
these little stumbles that indicate that he is definitely not all that Morland apprehends him to be. So after the dinner with Beche and Cooper, Morland returns to his dorm. We get these repeated beats as he's talking with first Champagne and then the other cadets, where he's talking about brandy and he's talking about honor, and he's so awestruck.
lit
He's so starstruck. He's just gleaming at the prospects of the year ahead. And that is just taken a step further when David Shawn organizes for him a corridor dance routine.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it reminded me of watching the high school band do their routines. Color
It's
guard.
Not color guard.
It's
You're
basically
completely
color
right.
guard.
Yeah.
It's really cool. It's very impressive, but it's full on a dance routine. I remember writing down in my little book of notes, gender is dumb.
Then we move forward into the commencement ceremony of the following day, and wow, is there pomp? You best believe it. Is there
much pomp.
circumstance?
So much
By
circumstance.
the bucketful. It's stunning. And we really get to see through Timothy Hutton's eyes the best version of this life, that this really is the pinnacle of what being a military man can be. And then we get the first of what we might consider to be two different inciting incidents, both of which
Yes.
serve a similar overlapping structural purpose in the film. This is when Beche delivers this gorgeous speech about Bunker Hill Military Academy being closed down so that the land can be sold for the development of condominiums. It is, again, as we've been discussing, this is a fantastic speech, and it's really easy to miss what is important here, but it is still complex and it is still challenging. And he is asserting this happens when you put a figure of authority on screen. What that figure of authority within the frame of the narrative says can be taken as what the film is saying.
Right.
But I do think that Harold Becker incredibly skillfully creates distance between Beche and Morland and us.
Yes, I do.
We then move pretty quickly, I think, into the second inciting incident at the dance, the commencement dance.
Right.
As the cadets and their dates are gathering, the townies are outside throwing beer cans and a surprising number of slurs.
Oh, yeah.
Even that this was 1981, just like a really uncomfortable.
Yes, there's, of course, homophobia in the film, probably surprising no one.
Yeah.
Yes.
A fight breaks out, and when General Beche intervenes to break it up, one of the townies, well, it's ambiguous.
It is. Yeah.
It is clear. I watched the sequence
Very clear.
4 or 5 times. It
Very
is
clear.
Very clear that it is the boy's hand on the pistol.
Absolutely.
The pistol is fired. The other young man drops dead immediately because, in this kind of circumstance, narratively, this is never going to be a wounded individual. He
Right.
just drops dead right on the spot. But then when we cut back, Beche's hand is on the gun.
Yeah. It's so odd.
Immediately, one of the townies says, "You killed him."
And there
Beche
is
seems
no
to believe that this
investigation.
is
He
true.
does, yeah. And everybody else does too. And it's never brought up again.
But we definitely could. I mean, it isn't perhaps easy to ask George C. Scott for another take where a 20-year-old man is on his back and he's kind of spinning around awkwardly. Maybe you just decide that what you've got is good enough. But I really needed it to be his hand and not the young
Yeah.
man's hand on the gun.
Or I needed to know that he was taking the fall for this kid because he
That's
was
the other possible
the
interpretation.
general.
I was waiting
that's
for
what you
that.
do. Yeah.
Yes. But that would have been contrary to his specific character, I think. I don't think that Beche takes the fall for a civilian killing
Not
another
a civilian. He would have for one of the boys.
Yeah. But
Maybe that's
he
how they should have
is
done it. I don't know.
honoring that line, even if that line ought not to be honored.
Mm.
So what do you think of this double inciting incident structure? First, we have the kids all riled up. We get Morland feeling passionate because Bunker Hill is going to be taken away, because it is going to be swallowed up by the most civilian enterprise, real estate development, right? This conflict between ancientry and pageantry and honor and dignity and the crassest kind of commercialism,
Right.
particularly in the early 1980s. So we've got that conflict already established, and then we have the personal conflict of Beche being taken away into custody, and then, as the boys hear on their radio set, suffering a heart attack.
Yeah.
But there's no conflict there because Beche either did not shoot that young man or did shoot that young.
Yeah.
It's not presented to us as ambiguous. And then it is also completely dropped. It's not even really used as
Yeah.
a starting spark for the rest of the conflict.
It doesn't make any sense to me. It's a weird non sequitur because, especially since from the beginning with his glasses of brandy and my doctor says I can only have one cigar and this is my third today. Like we've been
And we see him taking heart medicine twice.
like
before
this man is going to have a heart attack. We all know he's going to have a heart attack. He doesn't need to also shoot a kid. So I guess because it's in the book. Is that why it's there?
Well, that is it, in fact.
Yeah.
That is the sole inciting incident in the book.
Oh.
But here we switch our focus.
It's a big change
Well-
to just lose the gun, to lose the shooting completely.
Yeah.
And instead just have they're shutting down the school to make condominiums does seem like it's really changing.
Shutting down the school in a year. Base
year.
suffers a heart attack. The Board of Trustees decides that no, they're shutting the school down now. That seems to me to be just as efficacious.
Yes.
Because that is, if you take the shooting out, that is what happens in the film.
Yeah.
That seems to me to be as structurally strong as also he accidentally shoots a kid and it triggers some trouble with the townies. Because we're not at any point defending ourselves from, ragtag bands of townsfolk coming up with pitchforks and flaming torches. That doesn't play any part in this proceeding. So the way that we switch focus, it makes sense to me in that we are presenting these boys in a more sympathetic light if this is really about, the dignity of this august institution and preserving it for the next generation and all of the things that they talk about tradition and the like. That makes them more sympathetic than, no, our commanding officer killed a kid in the street and has been arrested for it, as he should be.
Yeah.
But we're also not taking advantage of our commanding officer has been taken into custody for a crime that he did not commit, which would also work as an inciting incident.
Which would make more sense for closing ranks like they do. Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit messy.
Well, good news. We're not going to spend any more time thinking about it, and it's just going to be about the closure of the school from here on out.
Right, yeah, and the general dies. Spoilers.
Yeah. So from there, we branch into two simultaneous plot threads, which will define the shape of the rest of this story. We have Moreland going into the armory where he finds the dean of students taking inventory of cases of guns and grenades.
Insane amount of weaponry at this school. Yeah.
Really upsetting.
Really upsetting. Yeah. And we'll see so much of it later, and it just gets more and more upsetting.
With that great beat, too, when they realize that Moreland's in there, and they say, how did you get in? And he said, through the door.
Yeah, the door was open.
Oh, my God, this isn't even... Oh, my God. It is one of the clearest moments where the film is very strong on its perspective, as distinct from the perspective of the individual characters contained within it. We also then have the other guys taking 2 trucks into town to dupe a local store owner out of some food, I guess, because they know that this siege is coming.
Yes.
I do think that Sean Penn is terrific in the scene where he is bluffing the grocer, pulling all of that military bombast, all of that like technicality and all of that formalism into his language.
Totally.
That's a really nice moment from him. Trouble, though, as the convoy begins to return to school, one of the trucks stalls out. They are beset by townies. And we have Tom Cruise taking action. We have David Shawn firing his weapon into the air.
Yeah.
What did you feel about that sequence as we're moving through it?
Just that you're beginning to see things come off the rails a little bit. It was interesting because it didn't seem like a terrible choice at the time for Sean, because it was just the quickest way to get everybody to clear the area. No one was hurt. No one was harmed. We didn't even get like much in the way of punches thrown yet, right?
No.
Yeah. So it did just break everything up. But then to also see later when Moreland is like, that's not how we do it, and this should have gone better, and Sean Penn saying, I can't believe you guys are even calling this a successful mission. It was interesting because I didn't know then how far things were going to go. So it was a nice escalation, I think, that got me thinking about how far these kids were going to go.
Yeah, escalation is a really good word for this film, I think. A useful word for this film because, last week we talked about Endless Love and how that kept exceeding what was even possible within its own narrative frame. It kept breaking the rules of its own world to get bigger and wilder and weirder. And Taps never does that. It is clear from the first frame of Taps where this story could go, and then it goes there.
And then it goes there. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's, part of building an effective tragedy is setting the framework, warning the audience, there are going to be consequences for this.
Yeah.
And then delivering those consequences.
It's true. Within the first, 2-3 minutes of the film that kids are going to die.
I would love to know from our audience if anyone else feels that creeping sense of dread
Yeah.
through that long tracking shot. I don't know. I'm unable to pin down exactly what it is that I find so upsetting about it. But yes, from that moment,
Yeah.
oh no, this is only going one way. This
Yes,
is bad
yes.
news.
I am always upset by churches and church iconography, and anytime I see just indoctrination of children. So
Sure.
I had the dread, but I would be interested to know if people who did not have my particular baggage also felt it.
We should note, too, that when leaving the scene of the confrontation with the locals, they smash through a police car, which is a
That's
really
right.
interesting bit of imagery for me as a viewer of this film who is interested in this conflict between militarism and civilianism.
Yeah.
Particularly, again, in the 40 years that have passed between this film and this recording. Our relationship with the police has changed. The role of the police has changed. It has become overtly militaristic.
Yes.
And to see here that distinction still being drawn so clearly. Yes, the police have guns. Yes, they're armed. The sheriff's department, right, when they come for the weapons from the armory, have guns. They are armed. He tries to arrest Moreland. But that is a civil authority, and it cannot put a hand on the military authority of the Bunker Hill Military Academy. So we enter the siege phase of this film, which is really going to last the rest of the running time.
Yeah.
Right? We've got very upsetting images of small boys, 10-year-old boys, dragging sandbags to create gun emplacements by that iconic gate.
Which is made so much more upsetting knowing they're doing exactly what they were trained to do.
Yes.
It's so chilling.
Yeah. The role of the younger boys in this film, I think, is really interesting. Because
it is. It's odd to me that there are only 2 of them, right? Or do we just only see the 2?
There are more. We just focus on 2.
Okay.
Yeah. We have like 2 title characters in the ensemble who get names, but there are more younger kids too. There's a whole year of them, presumably.
Yes.
You come to Bunker Hill when you are 12,
when
I guess.
You're 12.
I'm
yes.
exaggerating, rounding them down to 10. But they are young looking kids. Yeah.
Boys. Excellent performances by these kids too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that scene early on. In fact, it's a character introduction to Brian Moreland as he's coming down the hallway and he opens the door to their dorm room, to their barrack room, and they're watching the tiny little TV in the suitcase and they kick it closed. He comes over
at attention
and inspects everything and then lets them off the hook and leaves.
Yeah.
It's a really great moment of his, what we take in the first instance to be his humanity and his goodness and his generosity, but it's not. It's just him respecting his peers, his soldiers.
Yeah.
It's not him being in general, in aggregate, a good person. It's about him being very specifically a good leader of this type of young man.
Yeah.
Overall, though, I think it is interesting that I am not bothered particularly by Penn, by Cruz, by Hutton, by Esposito carrying guns and wearing uniforms in this film. They are old enough. 19 to 22, I think, is the age range here. Tom Cruise is the youngest at 19.
Actors,
Sean Penn is the oldest at 22. But yeah, seeing those 12-year-olds running around with the guns,
like
upsetting.
Big with assault rifles.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really upsetting. Yeah. There's a great sequence where one of the kids, who I think is one of the Red Berets, is asking, he goes to Tom Cruise, David Sean's room, and where he's pumping iron and looking pretty flippin' buff, I might add.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? And hey man, you got a grenade?
Yes.
And he just kind of gives him a dirty look, and he wanders off to the next guy. He's like, hey, you got a grenade? The guy's like, oh yeah. Just tosses it to him like it's a beanbag.
Yeah. Don't eat it.
Don't eat it, chump. Yeah. Chunk, whatever your name is. Chunk, I think. Anyway, awful.
So from here we move into the pressure cooker of this film, into this siege. We have a lot of conversations through the first night of, are we doing the right thing? What is it that we want? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? We're laying out an incomplete and very polarized version of the philosophical schema of this film as a whole.
We should go ahead and say, for those who didn't watch the film, what the 3 demands were that Moreland had when he took siege.
So this is the scene where the sheriff and the dean of students return to the armory to find that, all them guns is gone.
Uh-huh.
Where could they have gone to? And Brian Moreland confronts them, backed up by his cadre of red beret M16 wielding young men, and lays out their terms. They have 3 conditions. They want to have a meeting with General Beche. They want to talk to General Beche. They want a commission to investigate the sale of the school for real estate exploitation of the land, and they want a meeting with the Board of Trustees. That's it. That's all that they want. But clearly, they want those things so that they can coerce them through military force into protecting the school.
I don't even think it's necessarily that they want it for the coercion. It's just, it's again the thing you said about you want the right thing, but you're doing it the wrong way. That his dad says, like, these are such simple things, I feel like if they had just gone and asked politely, they would have gotten it immediately.
Do you believe at this point that Moreland is so invested in the military infrastructure of Bunker Hill that, well, of course, a commission will determine that you cannot sell this school.
Yes.
And of course, the board of trustees, if I can just talk to them, will be reasonable and not close the school. And of course, if I can just talk to General Beche, I can uncover the truth and he'll be released and everything will be fine. You think that Moreland believes that at this point?
At this point, I think so.
Okay.
Or he thinks he does. It seems to me that he really genuinely feels that this is his only way to be heard and to be taken seriously. But by doing it, he puts himself into a point where he absolutely cannot be heard or taken seriously, because then he is a terrorist.
Yeah.
And we don't negotiate with terrorists. It's just like rule number one.
And what's lovely about this film is that everybody outside of that immediate battalion understands that.
Yes.
No one at any point speaks in advocacy for these children.
No.
Because they all understand how the world works.
Especially these trained soldiers that we have been told are going on to go into school where you leave an officer. They are going to be officers. And you cannot, at this point, as soon as they make this decision, you cannot let them go without consequence.
Yeah.
You can't.
We then have the first meeting with the parents, and we get this great scene between Brian and his father, who
Yes.
is also a military officer, but of a lower rank, of course. Do you expect me to call you Major?
Yeah.
This is great
It
stuff,
is.
particularly demonstrative of the bridge between the civilians and the military officers. Even the moment where Brian's father leads him away from the others, just give me a chance to talk to my son, leads them away, like creating a physical gap
Yeah.
between these two worlds and these two realms of experience, but then does not soften in his approach to what Brian is doing.
No.
You're right, critical of Beche throughout this process.
Mm-hmm.
He's critical of what Brian is doing, ends up striking him, ends up hitting him.
Right.
Brian gathers his dignity and returns inside. And we get the first of 3 beats where we are going to let people leave. We have the first moment where he
Right.
says, people out there, they think you're hostages. If you want to go, go. And not one person stirs.
Not one. Yep.
Night falls. We get the sense that we have reached this uneasy status quo, but of course we haven't, because these boys have taken a school by force.
Yes.
So the National Guard turn up.
Yes.
That is an incredible piece of cinematography. I
It
will
sure
say.
is. It sure is.
So striking. This is where we have the moment that we discussed earlier, where Moreland gives the order, no one fires unless I give the word, understood. And then we have West encountering the sentry who says,
Yeah.
no, actually, David Shawn said I can shoot anyone I like as long as they're coming over the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So then we see the first kid leave.
Yes, which is haunting.
Haunting scene,
Yeah,
absolutely.
a really young kid who now they're surrounded by the National Guard. They've got all of this weaponry surrounding
Mm-hmm.
them, pointed at them. And even though they've got their own, it just doesn't feel safe anymore. It isn't safe anymore.
Well, and we also have the trucks driving by with recorded messages playing through the loudspeakers. Well, that's a question. Did you take that as recorded messages playing through the loudspeakers, or
I
the
didn't
parents
at
actually
first.
loaded into the backs of the trucks?
At first, I took it loaded in the backs of the trucks, but then they were saying playing the tapes,
Yeah,
right?
and they
So
are
then-
repeating. The last one that we
Yes.
get is a recapitulation of the first one. I also took it as, wow, they're just driving the parents around with
with
bullhorns,
bullhorns.
huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
which would probably have worked better, actually. Like
Maybe.
I feel like if one of the moms had come to the gate and
It
been
is
like,
oddly inhuman, isn't it?
yeah, it
Yeah.
is. And it feels more manipulative, which of course it is.
Right. And we do a great job through these sequences, I think, of putting us in the experience of these boys, of really
Yes.
anchoring our experience of these events.
We do, and not even the parents, honestly, which is interesting. I think I certainly thought of it as a parent having young boys and thinking about what our culture teaches young boys about their position in the
Yeah.
world and their power in the world.
Well, and finding that sense of fraternity, how valuable
Yes.
and how dangerous that can be, right? We have seen that weaponized in the
Absolutely.
real world in a multitude of ways in recent years, and it's not a different mechanism. It's just the same mechanism occurring in different spheres.
Yeah, there's not a big difference between the locker room on a airbase than the locker room in a junior high. You wish that there was,
Sure.
but there isn't.
Yeah. Or a message board in a shady corner of the internet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. In any case, our first deserter is incredibly young. He
Yeah.
looks about 8, even though we know that nobody there is younger than 12. But they did a good job casting this kid just leaping over the sandbags, shouting, don't shoot me, I don't want to die.
Yeah.
And that's when those outside begin to suspect that this is actually a group of child hostages, which in a sense It is.
Well, we've had that implication made already in Brian's meeting with his father. He's already laid out the idea that the other parents
Right.
lay
That's
out the idea
true.
that, how do we know
is
you're not
true.
holding us? My son would never take part in it. No, all of the children are there entirely voluntarily.
Yeah.
One cracks, though, you're right, and flees. And we learned the following morning at muster that, in fact, almost a dozen kids have walked off in the night because, of course, they have. The smartest have left their posts. Yes. No one, though, crucially, from David Shawn's company. It is at this point that we are introduced to the last great character in this film. This is when we get Colonel Kirby, the commanding officer of this detachment of the National Guard, who is just fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh my God, what a performance. This is, of course, the brilliant Ronnie Cox. You can't watch a movie from the 1980s or the early 1990s without seeing Ronnie Cox. You can't watch a movie for much of the last 50 years without seeing Ronnie Cox. Beverly Hills Cop, of course. Total Recall, he's fantastic. Very famously in RoboCop. Absolutely definitive of that kind of 80s movies. And he's maybe never better than in this film. Kirby is such a fantastically drawn character. None of his dialogue feels forced. None of it, crucially, feels oratorical the way that Beche's does earlier in the film.
Absolutely.
It feels so grounded, so honest, so gentle, but also so firm. It is such a brilliant example of, exactly the kind of strong, empathetic soldiery that we've been discussing all the way through this film.
Yeah. No, he really makes it a point to tell Moreland that he is stuck in the middle between the governor's wishes, because he is just a soldier who does what he is told, and
that's how it works.
And that's
obeying that civil authority.
Exactly. And trying to explain to Moreland, like, you have started something that you can't finish. Stop now.
Because if I have to, I'm going to. And it's going to be bad for everyone.
Yeah. Oh, just horrible.
That night, the water is cut off. Tension is building. This is where Dwyer loses it. He begins his silly interview thing. It's unclear here to what degree he is play acting and to what degree this material is perhaps getting away from Sean Penn a little bit.
Yeah.
I do not have a handle on Dwyer through this sequence at all.
I don't either. As a character in general, I don't have a handle on Dwyer, which I think we're not supposed to, because he's Muggle born. He's, he's not from a military family.
Only half. His father was an enrolled officer too, but they are crucially dead. He is from a different kind of domestic background as well. It's implied a different economic background.
It is implied,
than the rest of the people, the rest of his peers.
Right. Who are all the children of officers, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah. So Dwyer and Moreland get into a fist fight, which is only interrupted when the electricity is also cut off. And boy, howdy, the National Guard, they have some dramatic timing, because that's when a tank rolls up.
Yes. A tank seems like a bit much. Are they at this point just trying to intimidate the children? Is that the idea, do you think? This is where it starts to get fantastical.
So tensions are rising. A group of cadets is trying to start the emergency generator very carelessly with gas. And look, we obviously like this film. I think that's pretty fair to say. I think that this film is beautifully shot in large part. I find the application of violence to be very specific and harrowing. Giancarlo Esposito has the most dramatic and over-the-top flaming death.
Yeah. It wasn't death, I think. He just got taken out. He seemed to be unconscious on the stretcher, but his face was showing.
Okay.
In movies, if your face is not showing, you are dead.
Well, he is removed from the proceedings. We shall not see him again.
Yeah.
So narratively.
Narratively.
In a sense, narratively passed on. But this is great, because this is the moment where we see Brian begin to change. Because when meeting again with Kirby, he says, okay, I only have one demand now. I will bring it all down. We can stop this. I only have one demand. I need a victory so that this can end peacefully. I need to meet with Beche. Which is when Kirby tells us, of course, that Beche has died.
Yes.
In the world's most predictable turn.
Right.
But a turn that is nonetheless, I think, delivered in a fairly effective and compelling manner.
Yeah. But this puts Moreland in a really interesting position now, because he feels that if he backs down, he has completely lost the respect of all of his men.
Well, and he is now the torchbearer for all that Beche represented.
Right.
Beche could tell him to stand down, and he could still preserve his honor and his dignity. He can't do that now
really good
if he gives in.
Yeah.
This is where we get the great monologue from Kirby about Beche being a death seeker and about what a soldier really fights for, what a soldier really lives for. and Moreland standing in opposition to that.
Yeah.
We get this,
Also a terrible clunky line though. It's like death is only one thing. Bad. And I was like, okay.
yeah,
But it does stand nicely in contrast to the to like the romantic oratory.
you're right. I hear what you're saying. Clearly, what we're aiming for there is a kind of a kind of everyday punchy, effective
Yeah.
language that is not flowery.
Right.
But yeah, maybe a little flowery
Just
would
a
have
little
elevated
more.
that.
Just a little more flower.
Just give it a
Just
little
a little
twist.
bloom on that rose.
Sure. We then have the memorial service for Beche in the rain.
It's beautiful.
Gorgeously shot. We have the playing of taps, of course. And that night, the second tank pulls up. One of the young cadets, in an outright panic, runs for the gate, drops his weapon as he's running to safety.
Mm-hmm.
It accidentally discharges and fires into the ranks of the National Guard. And they, in return, open fire on the boy who is gunned down.
The boy behind him, as a matter of fact, who was chasing after him. Yeah.
Yeah. Awful.
Awful, really upsetting. To me, not narratively satisfying. I certainly hope in a real world situation, this gun that went off fired up into the sky. So it's not like someone returned fire because the guy next to him just got shot. Somebody just got spooked. And
right. I think that's intentional, though. I think this is the film telling us that this is what happens when you have a lot of guns. Someone is going to make a mistake.
someone makes a mistake.
And
Yeah.
someone is going to be compelled
Yeah.
to take action in response. That
Because
this is inevitable.
Yeah.
That for me is what is so harrowing about it, is that this was always going to happen.
Yeah.
There was
is
always
a
going to
point.
be a moment, and it's not going to be David Shawn choosing from the window to shoot at Kirby. It is going to be some dumb kid drops his gun,
Yeah.
and this is the consequence. This is what happens. These are the stakes. And when the stakes are this high, it is inescapable.
Yeah.
It's awful. It's so harrowing
It
to
is
watch.
awful. It is awful. Yeah. And they treat it with the gravitas that it deserves, certainly.
Yes. This is, I think, what redeems this part of the film,
Mm.
is that the film takes this event very seriously and
Yes.
plays it completely straight.
Yes. And it gives Timothy Hutton a moment to really show his acting chops.
That's true. That's true. We also get an interesting twist on these confrontations that we've had so far, because the gates are open, the ambulance is allowed in to recover the body of the young man, and Kirby, standing in the yard, addresses not Moreland, but the massed ranks of this battalion. He starts talking to the men, warning them, this is what is going to happen.
Yes.
If you persist, we are going to have to come in here. We don't want to. No one wants this to be happening, but we can't make it stop. You can.
Yeah.
Dwyer goes in search of Moreland and finds him watching old film of Beche delivering just these endless speeches, valorizing the past,
importantly-
valorizing the doomed.
Yeah.
Like,
Using the exact same language, which I think is so important. It's
course.
rehearsed. Like these are the words that he says every time in this situation.
yeah.
And so you lose that naturalism and humanity that you get from Kirby.
And this is really the emotional climax of
Yeah.
the story. This was always going to be where the fate of the few were decided, and our paths really are locked here, both by Dwyer on the one hand and by Shawn on the other. What do you think of Sean Penn in the? I'm just now realizing that perhaps it is confusing that we are switching between character
I
names
know,
and actor
sorry,
names.
yeah.
And David Shawn and Sean Penn do
Yeah.
share, obviously, one name. I hope that hasn't been confusing as we've
We
been
would
moving through
never
this
call
podcast.
Sean Penn Sean, though.
I really wouldn't. I really wouldn't.
We're not that close.
What do you think?
What's
You
your
said earlier
relationship
he
with
was
Sean
your
Penn?
boyfriend. What do you think of Sean Penn in this? I will put my cards on the table first. I will make myself vulnerable here. I think he's actually at his best in this scene.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
No, he's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's lovely.
Equally, Timothy Hutton delivering just a knockout and incredibly adult performance.
Yes.
Just giving a real world weariness
Yeah.
in these
yeah.
closing moments. Dwyer urges Moreland to declare victory, to just decide that they have won. This is like,
Which is so interesting. Just
Isn't
declare
it?
victory is what he says. Just declare it.
that is what your sense of honor demands.
Yeah.
But there are no terms here. You can't get the thing that you want, so just say that you it's not say that you've won, right? It's not go out and lie to the boys and tell them that we've won. It's decide that you have won.
Yes.
Change the terms of this engagement and decide that you have won so that you can preserve your honor and we can all walk out of here.
Which is also chilling because that's an option that you can just say,
I mean, Kind of.
In this context, it is.
Well, we have to ask, because of what happens to Brian Moreland, we have to ask, is it? Would he ever have recovered from this?
No.
He wouldn't have been able, obviously, to continue his military career.
It's more that they would believe that they could, I suppose.
Right. In that moment,
that would have
he
been
could
enough
have
of the rhetoric that you could believe that you just
lied to
changed
himself
the game.
to save the lives of his men from the National Guard.
Mm.
They walk out in what is a phenomenally shot sequence. They walk out of this dark room into the coming dawn. You know, we've had this repeated beat from Kirby, from Ronnie Cox saying, "Come the dawn, come the dawn."
Yeah.
And here, the dawn is here. They walk out into it, calling out to everyone that it's over.
Yeah.
That everyone needs to muster in the yard.
Mm-hmm.
It's done. The boys run. This is a
Everyone's
very
excited,
extended
which is great.
sequence
Yeah.
here. And that's basically,
You see the relief.
kind of our last line of dialogue. We're just moving now into a much more emotionally powerful, kind of impressionistic ending as we move from the muster yard itself up to the window where David Shawn has shouldered his rifle and decides to go out in a blaze of glory, I guess.
Yeah. I wish it was more motivated. I hear what you're saying about how like he's just the animalistic one and he just wants it all to end in bullets and death.
Well, in glory, right? He
glory,
calls it beautiful.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful. We talk all the time about characters having sufficient motivation. If you have enough motivation, you can justify, narratively speaking, any action. You can make a character do anything if that motivation is grounded enough, is deep enough, is big enough.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I don't know that we do that here, but I can see the shape of what we're going for. I'm just ultimately a little disinterested because at this point in the story, David Shawn is just the hand of narrative justice. He is just the hand of tragedy taking action, right? He has to do this so that Moreland can pay the due price for his hubris.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just the film has done such a nice job of showing the humanity of these boys. To then give David Shawn none seems like a shame.
I do see what you're saying.
It just seems a little bit cheap.
Again, I'm going to defend this film on the grounds of intentionality.
Sure,
I think that is not an oversight. I think that is deliberate, but I do see where you're coming from.
I'm thinking of like how I would have changed it narratively to give him more motivation, to make it make sense. And I'm wishing that the boy who had been shot, Charlie, that the special relationship was not between him and Moreland, but between him and David Shawn. So that way David could feel like he was, avenging the death of this young boy or something. I wanted something to make him taking that machine gun into his hands, not just completely batshit crazy and insane.
I see what you're saying there, and I do think that is a more human-grounded kind of motivation, a more human-grounded kind of characterization.
Which we gave everybody else.
But I think you lose some of the iconicity there. I think you lose some of the thematic power of men like David Shawn. And, the world has men like David Shawn. There are just people like that who want to pull the trigger for the sake of pulling the trigger, who want to burn it up. And you're right. I think that maybe this film is not the place to explore that kind of character. Maybe there's another way of approaching it that does preserve the very human complexity that we've brought to this text.
Yeah, and how young they are, I suppose.
That too. It does feel, yes, you're right. Perhaps one of the ways in which David Shawn is most different from the other characters is that he is fixed. He's not changing. He's not growing. He doesn't have a future past this.
That's a point.
He's already reached all that he is ever going to be. It is an undeniably powerful end to a film that, if you're watching carefully, I think has really demanded a lot of you as an audience.
Definitely.
I am, weirdly, this is not a feeling I have very often, but perhaps, a little bit of this is coming off the back of Endless Love and seeing a film that misunderstood its own text so egregiously. This film demonstrates in its final movement how completely it knows what it is doing. It is so sure-footed. It so fully delivers on the inescapable premise that it establishes in the first frame. This is an excellent example, I think. An incomplete example, as you've noted, but an excellent example of that kind of robust narrative, tragic craft.
Yes. Yes. We should say, too, for those who didn't watch the film, that, of course, Moreland rushes up to the tower where David Shawn is firing. He tries to stop him. He is caught in the crossfire, and both young boys are killed. and it's Sean Penn's character that is
Dwyer
left. Dwyer
carries Moreland out. Yes,
carries Moreland
into
out
the dawn light.
in a really beautiful and moving sequence.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
very powerful stuff. And then
And there's something powerful too in that no one carries Sean out.
No.
Like no one believes that that kid was a hero or.
But this is the irony, is that Moreland in this last action, yes, it is tragic. Yes, he is paying the price for his actions. But crucially, he is also dying exactly the kind of death that he would have wanted.
Oh, that's
He
horrible.
has finally got what he wanted.
Yeah.
And it is heroic because he will be remembered for ending this. He will be remembered for
Rather
running
than
back
starting
into the
it now.
firefight.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, it is. But it's also the end. There is a little formality before we wrap up our discussion on TAPS, which is the big list of every Tom Cruise movie ever. Right now, let me double check. Number 1 is Endless Love.
So weird.
What do you think? Does TAPS go above or below?
Oh, hell yeah. Way above Endless Love. Definitely.
Do you think, perhaps this is the more interesting question, do you predict that TAPS will be in the top half of the Tom Cruise filmography by the time we're done?
Ooh, in the top half.
I'm not going to hold you to this.
Maybe.
Just a gut check here.
Maybe.
I'm thinking maybe bottom of the top half.
Bottom of the top? Yeah. It's going to be in the middle. It doesn't sound as exciting when you say it's just going to be in the middle. But yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good film.
For his second screen credit
Difficult
to be
film.
somewhere in the middle of his filmography, I think is very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Do you see in this performance who Tom Cruise will turn out to be?
I do, very
Yeah?
much. Yeah. As I said right at the beginning, this is an interesting example of the kind of work that we're going to see from Cruise. He is capable in this phase of his career of entering fully into character. This is,
Oh, yeah.
it's obviously him. It's more him in a sense than Billy in Endless Love. It feels more cruisy because
I
it's
don't
just
know
a
that I
more
feel that it
developed
does.
character.
Interesting.
But to me, at least, yeah, this is an alternate version. If Tom Cruise hadn't been a movie star, if he had just been an actor, this is the kind of thing that I think he would have done more often. And it's not completely distinct from certain characters that we're going to get from him much, much later in his filmography. We are going to be talking about David Shawn intermittently, but consistently through the entire run of this podcast.
You're
I
probably
predict.
right. Yeah, it's interesting because I just never think. I mean, I guess I just think of Tom Cruise always, as a twinkle charm leading man guy, even when he's the action hero or
Sure.
whatever it is that he is now. And so it's hard to imagine these character roles that have no nuance and no
The
goodness.
nuance, certainly. I will say, I do think that Cruise is bringing more nuance to Shawn than is on the page. I do think that because he is still irrepressibly Tom Cruise, not fully formed yet, but he does have those moments. That very first interaction when he flips off Dwyer on the staircase, those moments when he comes in after Moreland has been promoted and he's beginning the whole organized choreographed sequence in the hallway, there is some charm there. There is something very light there.
Yeah.
So I don't think that stuff's on the page. I think that is the Cruise of it all. And I think that is what we're going to see moving forward. Before we get to the topic of next week's show, I'd like to take a moment to thank everybody for listening. This is the first podcast that we've recorded since we launched The Last Star in Hollywood, and the response has been super exciting, you guys. It's been absolutely thrilling. It has been so great to connect with everybody on all the social medias and through email and basically every time my phone has beeped for the last few days, I haven't felt the same sense of dread as I have for the last, 5 or 6 years. Because it's most often a wonderful person saying hi. And that's great. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like to support The Last Star in Hollywood, you can head on over, of course, to laststarpod.com or to our Patreon, patreon.com/laststarpod, where you can get access to our monthly bonus episodes. Right now, over on that Patreon page, we are voting on the topic of our first month's bonus episode, which is going to be a choice between, let's see if I can remember this right off the top of my head, The Last Starfighter, Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and the fourth one.
Last Action Hero.
Last Action Hero.
Naturally.
It was on the tip of my tongue. So you can head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/laststarpod, pledge your support, and decide what we are going to talk about in our bonus episode for October. That's coming up soon, in fact. We're going to have to close that poll pretty soon, I guess.
Yes.
Next week on Last Star Pod, Curtis Hanson's sex comedy Losing It from 1983. A likely candidate for the worst film in Tom Cruise's entire filmography, a 4.9 on the IMDb, the lowest of Cruise's entire career. But it's his first leading role, and we have to talk about it.
We do.
Except there is a wrinkle, and you don't know this. Losing It was screened at a film festival in Columbia, South Carolina in August of 1982. But its wide release didn't come until April of 1983, a full month after The Outsiders. So technically, we could decide to do The Outsiders next week and do Losing It the week after.
Ooh.
I am putting this into your capable hands, Elizabeth.
No.
Which one would you like to discuss? The absolutely seminal tale of Oklahoma,
yes.
The Outsiders.
Francis Ford Coppola. Or
a movie about a bunch of kids going to Tijuana.
It's going to be so bad.
It's going to be so bad.
I mean, I feel like we have to just go by what.
Are you
what
a vegetables
first
or a dessert first kind of girl?
I don't eat dessert.
There are lists,
but I will eat only the French fries off my plate.
There are lists which give either as the next film in his filmography, depending on whether you count the festival release in South Carolina.
In that case, I'm going to go with The Outsiders.
Wide release it is. All right.
Let's go with The Outsiders. I'm so looking forward to doing that one. We'll wait for Losing It, which has got to be, it's got to be terrible. It's got to be so.
There is a detail which might make you change your mind. If we do The Outsiders next week, that means that I have to do the improv trailer game, and you're going to do the improv trailer game for Losing It. So maybe.
No, I want to hear your improv trailer for Outsiders. That sounds good.
All right.
Yeah. Especially because you've never seen it before.
I've never seen it before.
Wow.
I have been saving it for exactly this moment.
That's lovely. You could read the book if you wanted to. It's only a couple of days read.
That's interesting. You've read the book extensively, though. So I might just give you book duties and I'll come cold to the film. That might be an interesting approach. Maybe I'll do a little short bonus episode over on the Patreon. After I've watched the movie, I'll read the book. And then we can have a little book discussion, do a little book time over on the Patreon, a little bonus content over there.
It's such a special book.
I can't wait. I can't wait for this one. I'm so excited. I'm so looking forward to it.
I hope I liked the movie better than I did the first times I watched it, because I watched it before when I was a teenager, probably in love with the book. And the movie felt dated to me in a way that I didn't appreciate, but especially, you know, when I was a teenager myself. And I was too in love with the book. I was one of those that's like, the book's so much better. But now I'm interested to watch it, you know, having gone to film school and seeing it as a Coppola film instead.
So tune in next week for me defending and Elizabeth nitpicking Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of S.E. Hinton's seminal novel, The Outsiders. You guys, thank you so much for listening. This has been a very long episode.
Yes.
It's been a really fun conversation. I'd love to hear more from all of you. You can find all of our contact information over at laststarpod.com.
Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.